Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Nigel Patrick. I am your chair for this meeting. I am a land use advisor with the Forestry Commission. In addition to chairing, I'll be giving a short presentation about the England Woodland Creation Offer. The main focus of the webinar is income from woodland, and we have two speakers, Oliver Coombe, who will be talking about timber markets, and Annie Gordon, who will be talking about carbon credits. Can I ask that you put questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A session after the presentations. This webinar is very well attended, so please be patient and wait for us to come to your question. If we run out of time or have any technical problems, we'll still endeavour to answer your question. As a land use advisor for Yorkshire, it's my job to respond to inquiries about woodland creation coming in from landowners and farmers in Yorkshire. I meet them on farm, look at the land and discuss what they want to do. I will then prepare a report for them outlining the grant opportunities and any constraints. Constraints can be things like peat or priority habitats where you cannot plant woodland. So very briefly, you can plant woodland in England in a number of ways. We promote the England Woodland Creation Offer, or EWCO for short, but you can also create woodland with help from community partners, local authorities and the Woodland Trust. The Forestry Commission can also provide you with advice about agroforestry. For the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to concentrate on the England Woodland Creation Offer. So this offer is designed for the wildlife income, improved productivity, diversification and landscaping. And when I talk to farmers, they're very much interested in biodiversity as well as income. With the England Woodland Creation Offer, you can get grant for the capital costs like tree planting and fencing, up to £10,200 per hectare, plus an annual maintenance grant of £400 per hectare over 15 years. So these are some examples of the things the capital pays for. Supply and plant a tree, £1, £72 each. If you follow that list down, sheep netting, £9.34 a metre. So it should cover the cost of planting your new woodland. So, and as I said, you can get £400 per hectare per year over 15 years for maintenance. In addition to that, you can get what we call additional contributions, which are of public benefit. So, for example, if your land is in an area where there's flooding problems, you can get extra money for flood alleviation. And this is the amount of money you can get. So for flood risk management, you can get £1,000 per hectare. These other items can also apply, and it makes it stackable. So if you want to improve access to the land, you can get £3,700 per hectare. And if it all stacked up, you would be getting £12,100 per hectare. You get that money when the new woodland is planted. So most commonly, EWCO woodland is small scale mixed broadleaf woodland. The minimum area to plant is 1 hectare, but you can plant more. You can plant productive woodland under this scheme too, but that can mean you lose some of the additional contributions, most notably those related to biodiversity, and those are at the top of the table. If you do want to know more about this grant, the England Woodland Creation Offer, we did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago, and we put a link in the chat, so you can look at that and find out more detail about it. I'm just skimming over it today. So now you know you can get grants to plant your woodland. and you can get maintenance over 15 years. So what other income can you get from the new Woodland? So this is where I hand over to Annie Gordon, who will talk about income from carbon credits from the new Woodland. I'll just introduce Annie. Annie's the Carbon and Water Projects Manager within the Policy and Advice team at the Forestry Commission. She's working on the promotion and development of the Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Water Code. Thank you, Annie.
Thanks, Nigel. Cool. So I think I've got the next 20 minutes or so to give you a brief introduction to what the Woodland Carbon Code is and how you can get involved. And I saw a question in the chat about whether it's just relevant to England or the whole of the UK. And just to reiterate, the Woodland Carbon Code is for the whole of the UK. Next slide, please. Thanks. So before I get into too much of the detail, I just wanted to start with some of the key take-home messages. So if you only remember a few things, 3 or 4 things from my part of the presentation, these are the things that we feel are the most important. So the Woodland Carbon Code is considered to be a high integrity carbon code, and it's internationally recognised for the high standards of sustainable forest and carbon management. You must register with the code before planting or site prep. So that's an important eligibility requirement to be aware of. And if you do intend to sell the units, the Woodland Carbon Code can provide an opportunity to generate long-term income from woodland creation projects. So as Nigel was saying, you can receive this on top of the grant income, hopefully, that you're getting. And that's relevant even for small schemes. So those opportunities are there for even small landowners to kind of aggregate their woodland creation plots with others. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as you'll all be aware, science is really clear that human activities have driven increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to levels not previously experienced. And as a result, we're seeing increased global surface temperatures, rise in sea levels, and changes in weather patterns. So we do know that to tackle the climate crisis, this requires deep and immediate emissions cuts. But alongside that, it also requires us to increase our nature-based solutions, such as woodland creation, to deliver carbon removals alongside those reductions in emissions. And I won't go into this too much detail because I'm sure you're already aware, but trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis and then store it in the biomass of the trunks, branches and roots. This is then locked up until the tree eventually dies, decays or is burnt. Some of that carbon from falling leaves will also enter the soil, so it'll be stored there for the long term. And some of the carbon might also be made into long-lived timber products, which acts as a sustainable carbon store for the lifetime of those products and can replace more fossil fuel intensive materials as well. So all of this makes the entire woodland ecosystem a really important carbon sink and carbon store and plays a really important role in the UK for reaching our national net zero targets. So in the UK, our government has set a target for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And net zero means it's referring to a state where greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere are balanced by removals out of the atmosphere. And the Climate Change Committee, who are an independent statutory body that advise government on emissions targets and progress, they actually released a report yesterday on how to deliver the 7th carbon budget. And in that they reiterated the really important role that trees and woodland creation will play and how it's vital that we double our tree planting rates for the sequestration benefits that it provides. Next slide, please. So firstly, what is the Woodland Carbon Code? So the Woodland Carbon Code is the government-backed quality assurance standard for verified woodland carbon projects in the UK. So it was first developed back in 2011 and it's run by Scottish Forestry on behalf of all of the UK. And essentially what the code does is it enables landowners to confidently quantify the amount of carbon dioxide that will be sequestered in their new woodland creation projects. And then subsequently, they can generate verified woodland carbon units through that. So these units can then be used either by the landowners themselves, so they can make claims within their own farm carbon accounting, or they could be sold on the UK voluntary carbon market as an extra income incentive. The Woodland Carbon Code uses globally recognised carbon assessment protocols and core principles, and it is endorsed by EWCO, which is the International Carbon Reduction Offset Alliance. There are a number of other international standards that the Woodland Carbon Code is applying for as well, including the new ICVCM standard. So these projects that go through the Woodland Carbon Code will also be verified by third parties, which makes sure that they demonstrate transparency and evidence-based methodologies to back up any of the claims that are made about the carbon that's been sequestered within the woodland. So this helps to provide confidence that these projects are delivering genuinely permanent removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So as a result of this, the woodland carbon units that are generated are in quite high demand. Demand definitely exceeds supply at the moment, and it's because buyers really value this high integrity element of the code, and because of that, it can then help provide that extra income stream for woodland owners, alongside potential grant or timber income. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll just touch a bit on the UK voluntary carbon market. So this is essentially a mechanism for the sale of the units and then helps to facilitate that financial support for projects. From a demand perspective, there is an increasing number of businesses that are voluntarily setting their own net zero targets. And these are organisations that essentially want to do the right thing, in terms of reducing their emissions and offsetting residual emissions, and also likely to be coming under pressure from investors or consumers to show how they're performing in response to the climate crisis. There's also, since 2009, large companies, so those of more than 500 employees, have to legally report on their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where the demand for these units tends to come from. So these organisations will be setting science-based targets to reduce their emissions as much as possible. However, inevitably there'll always be some residual emissions throughout their decarbonisation journey that they're much harder to reduce, or they're not able to fully reduce. So they can compensate for these by investing in woodland creation projects, and purchasing the woodland carbon units that they generate. The other side of the market that we see, though, is landowners and farmers holding on to their units that they generate through these projects to potentially use within their own farm carbon balance. We call that insetting as opposed to offsetting. And that will be those that are potentially facing pressure from supermarkets that might be looking to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, which are the indirect emissions from within their supply chain. But whichever approach that you take with the woodland carbon market, so insetting or offsetting, one woodland carbon unit still equates to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent that's removed from the atmosphere. So that's what the units that are generated through the Woodland Carbon Code. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are just quickly some of the key principles that I've already sort of touched on. And this is how the Woodland Carbon Code meets those high standards, and why it's globally recognised for this. So permanence is a really important element of the woodland carbon, of the voluntary carbon market. So woodland carbon units represent permanent emissions removals, and we're lucky that in the UK the market operates in an institutional and policy environment that provides particular safeguards around permanence for forestry. So we have legislation in place in the UK under the Forestry Act to protect against deforestation, which in some international global markets don't have the same assurances. All of the emissions removals are quantifiable. So we have a carbon calculator with the code that models a woodland sequestration capacity, and then we use the Forest Research carbon protocol to measure the actual sequestration that's been delivered. And then all of our emissions removals are also verifiable, so verified by an independent third party, which in this case is either the Soil Association or organic farmers and growers. And then the final point to talk about on this slide is additionality. So the Woodland Carbon Code ensures that all projects are legally and financially additional. So that requires an assessment of whether the woodland would have been created anyway without that carbon finance. So quick explanation of this, because it can get a bit tricky, is essentially if there's enough money without the carbon financing. So for example, if you're making enough money through grant or timber sale, that project doesn't necessarily need the money from carbon, so it may have gone ahead anyway, and it may have gone ahead and still sequestered that carbon regardless of whether it was in the Woodland Carbon Code or not. And essentially what the Woodland Carbon Code is there to do is to encourage more planting that's in addition to what is already happening. So that's why we have to use those additionality tests to make sure that it's new woodland and additional sequestration that's happening. And that is what buyers really value. And that's what holds up the voluntary carbon market, so that they know that when they buy these carbon units, they have essentially paid for that woodland to be planted. And that's really essential to the integrity of the code and to prevent the risk of greenwashing that you may hear about in some of the international markets and some of the real issues that they're having there. So that helps promote confidence in the market. But just to reiterate, you are still eligible to receive grant, timber and carbon income from a project. It's just about finding that balance and potentially needing to reduce the amount of grant income you receive, or mixing up the species mix in your woodland plan to make sure that you're also additional for the carbon market. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a few quick eligibility requirements. So the first thing, as I mentioned, is you have to register with the code before you begin any work on site. And this is called the project implementation date. That includes fencing, deer control, ground prep and planting. So just something to be aware of. You can't register sites that had previously been wooded, so restock sites aren't eligible. And the landowner has to commit to the permanent land use change to woodland. And alongside other projects, it has to be UKFS compliant and abide by the Forestry Act, as well as needing to be additional, as we just talked about. Next slide, please. Thanks. There's also a few things as landowners to be aware of when you register for the code, and just in terms of liability. So if you have a woodland carbon project and you sell your units up front, you are liable to then deliver those units. So if there is, say, a catastrophe, it's such as fire or wind blow, you will be required to replant. You can't leave it down to natural regeneration. Obviously, there are ways you can manage this to make sure your woodland is more resilient and purchase insurance, but just to be aware of these risks. Secondly, you do have to continuously verify the woodland every 10 years to show the growth and the progress, and that involves bringing in the third-party verifier to show the carbon sequestration. You will need to manage it as outlined originally, so you couldn't change your mind and clear fell it halfway through the project duration. And yes, it's just important to bear in mind that, there is the potential of having to buy back units if you sell them up front and then the woodland doesn't actually deliver as much carbon as you'd predicted. However, we are very conservative in the estimations to minimise that risk, so it's unlikely to happen. Next slide, please. So just to quickly talk about how the carbon calculation works. So it's based on science from forest research, and the model uses this data in our carbon calculator, and that allows us to predict the amount of carbon dioxide that a woodland will sequester over up to 100-year project duration. And there's an Excel spreadsheet that works this out for you, and you can download it on the website, which we'll share afterwards, the Woodland Carbon Code website. And within that, you enter all the details about the project, which will impact the amount of carbon dioxide it can sequester. So things like the species mix, the yield class, management regime, soil type will all affect how much you can predict. And you'll see this chart on the slide is an output from that calculator, and it shows you the rate of carbon sequestration over a project duration. You'll see it starts off sort of steeper in the early stages of the project as the young trees are growing quickly and sequestering CO2 at a faster rate, and then it shallows out as the project progresses towards a 100-year period, at which point the woodland will start to become more of a carbon store rather than a carbon sink. You'll also notice in the first 10 years of this projects start off with some carbon debt, which is the emissions from establishment. And so that needs to be paid off before you start sequestering carbon on top of that amount. You'll also notice from this chart that there are two different colours on the graph. So this, the blue at the top refers to the contribution to the buffer. So the two together are the gross amount of carbon sequestration. We remove automatically 20% of the total number of units that are predicted. And they are taken away, so you can't use them in reporting or sell them, and they're put into a central buffer pool. And that is because, as we mentioned before, there's always the risk of loss through catastrophe with woodland. And so by taking away that buffer, it's essentially an insurance safeguard for that investment for the buyers, ensuring that if anything happens to that woodland, there's always enough units in the buffer to account for any unanticipated losses in future. And we do take a very conservative approach with these calculations to make sure we're not over predicting. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of how it works with the units, there are two different types of units in the Woodland Carbon Code, and the units are the sellable thing. So 1 unit equals 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that also, in terms of equivalent, it includes other gases that contribute to climate change, such as methane and nitrous oxide. Because it takes a long time for woodland to grow, as you'll be aware of, the carbon won't be sequestered until later in that woodland's lifetime. And that's why we have the two different types of woodland to support landowners if they need more upfront income. So the pending issuance unit is essentially a promise to deliver a tonne of sequestered carbon at some point in this woodland's future. It's not guaranteed yet. So if you sell a pending issuance unit or a company buys a pending issuance unit, they can't use it to report against their emissions, because essentially it's not a ton of sequestered carbon. It's a promise in the future. But companies do buy PIUs, and then they have that in the pipeline to help know that they can account for their future emissions if needed as part of their net zero journey. A woodland carbon unit is then a tonne of carbon dioxide which has been sequestered in a Woodland Carbon Code verified woodland, and pending issuance units are converted into woodland carbon units once it's confirmed that the carbon's been sequestered. And it's once it turns into a woodland carbon unit, or if you sell it as a woodland carbon unit, that is when you can use them in carbon accounting. So right at the beginning of the project, after it's been planted, the total number of pending issuance units will be calculated across the length of the project. They'll all be assigned a year, so a vintage year, and that vintage is when you expect that tonne to be converted into a woodland carbon unit. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the process. I won't go into too much detail because we don't have a huge amount of time, but essentially this is the process that you go through to deliver those units. And as I mentioned, first thing you need to do, register the project with the Woodland Carbon Code before planting. It's free to do this. All you need to do is submit a map and an initial carbon calculation using that spreadsheet, using the template. And then you can go ahead, plant your woodland as planned. And apply to your grant as planned at that point. Then after planting and within 3 years of that original registration, you'll validate your project. So that will mean submitting your carbon calculator again if there's any changes to it, because you might have changed the woodland design plan. That's when you update that and you submit a project design document, and it's at that point that you do your additionality test. Validator will then confirm if they're happy with it, and if they are, you'll have your list of pending issuance units added to the UK Land Carbon Registry, where they're listed and tracked transparently. At this point, if you wanted to, you could sell your pending issuance units. We wouldn't recommend selling all of them upfront because it's best to have that insurance buffer for yourself later down the line. You don't want to be too liable, and a lot of people are holding on to them until they convert later down the line to see if carbon prices change, but you can sell pending issuance units at this point. 5 years after planting, you then have your first verification, which involves conducting a volumetric survey, which is then assessed by the same third-party auditors, so Soil Association or Organic Farmers and Growers. And then it's at that point that those pending issuance units within that vintage will be converted to woodland carbon units. And then you'll continue that verification process every 10 years. So from year 5, then year 15, and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned, all projects start with some carbon debt, some more than others from the planting activities. So most of projects won't expect their pending issuance units to convert into woodland carbon units until at least year 15, most likely. Next slide, please. So there are a few costs to be aware of, just to flag with the Woodland Carbon Code. As I mentioned, it's free to register. But there is a one-off cost of validation, which it varies depending on which validator you work with and the project specifics, but it could be, tends to be a couple of thousand. And then likewise, there is a cost every verification of a similar amount. So this can make it trickier for smaller schemes to enter in terms of making it cost effective. So schemes that are under 5 hectares, sometimes it might not be the most viable option to go into the Woodland Carbon Code. However, with smaller schemes, you can group up with other projects as well as for larger schemes as well, and that will significantly reduce some of those costs for validation and verification by grouping with other projects. So that's an option for smaller schemes. Next slide, please. So in terms of the amount of income that you might expect from selling units, the prices can really vary, and it's not required for the prices to be reported, so it can be quite difficult to get an idea of exactly how much landowners can expect to earn. We did do some research last year and asked market actors to report on some of their transactions, and we saw that the average pending issuance units on average were selling for about £23 a unit. But we do know we don't have enough stats for woodland carbon units yet, because not enough projects have got to that stage in their verification. But we know that that will be significantly higher for a woodland carbon unit. And there are many different things that might affect the price of a unit, and it really depends on what the buyer is looking for. So that price is agreed between seller and buyer. We don't kind of play any part in that part of the market. The things that might affect the price might be the vintage. So if those pending issuance units are expected to convert later down the line, that might be beyond a company's net zero target. So say after 2040, they'll be less expensive than the much more sooner vintages, which will be in much more high demand for companies to meet their targets. Also, if a project can tell a really good story about the other benefits that it provides, so that kind of the co-benefits around biodiversity, natural flood management, water quality, buyers might be willing to pay more for those kind of projects. According to DESNZ's reporting, carbon prices are likely to increase over the coming years as we get closer to those net zero targets. And we know that on average, a broadleaf woodland that's performing quite well would be likely to generate roughly around 500 woodland carbon units over that 100-year period. So say if they're receiving around £23 per tonne as the average we're currently seeing, that would be around 11,500 per hectare over that 100-year. And in England, our average size of a Woodland Carbon Code project is around 13 hectares. So that would be an extra 149,000 roughly income for that project if that was the carbon price at the time. But we do know some people are holding on to their units to sell later down the line in case that increases. So next slide, please. So yeah, just to finish off with those core messages again. So as I mentioned about the integrity of the code and sets it apart from some of those international schemes that are facing issues at the moment. You do need to register before the woodland before planting to generate those units. So, and that is, as I mentioned, it's free, zero obligation to validate and verify if you change your mind. But if you don't do that, you'll miss out on that opportunity. You can group together with other schemes to help save costs. And yes, more information can be found on the Woodland Carbon Code website, which we can put in the chat, because I know there is a lot of information in this, but they have lots of webinars, recordings on there and information that we can share, and contacts as well for you to speak to if you've got any further questions on it. But I think now I'm passing over to Ollie, is that right?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Annie. Thank you for that. Just a reminder to people to put any questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in the question and answer session after Oliver has spoken. Oliver Coombe is the managing partner of Timber Auctions. He will give us a market update and then outline the 10 steps to selling timber. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. That's an introduction to me, so please can I have the next slide. So I'm going to do a little update on what's driving the timber market today, because it's important to remember timber's a global commodity, and although we live in the UK and we will be talking about the timber trade in the UK, and particularly North and Midlands of England, it's influenced by factors across the world. And then we'll do a little bit about what's driving UK supply and demand. How is the price of timber that the grower gets? How is that actually determined and what influences it? And when you sell timber, there are elements of risk in it, and we're going to manage that. And then I will take you through a presentation about 10 steps to selling your timber, which is from an article I did for the RFS a few years ago. It's been fine-tuned to suit today's market, but it's primarily aimed at the lowland or farm estate woodland in the north of England and Midlands. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? So if you look at the global market today, we're in a period of volatility. In my life in the timber trade, it trundled along quite steadily through the late 90s, early 2000s. We had to deal with cheap imports from the Baltics, but it really started to get exciting with the credit crunch in 2007-8. And we've had since then this period of sort of spikes and troughs, which have had huge influence on the prices of, in 18-month periods, have doubled and then crashed again. We've had a little period of stability in late 23-24, but all the signs now are that we are going to go into further instability. And the one that we've really got to watch carefully is how President Trump behaves with his tariffs on timber. He's already put tariffs, quite substantial tariffs, on Canadian timber. He's talking about tariffs on European timber. And these are global trade patterns of timber. If European timber stops going to America, it's got to find another home. Historically, that's been the UK, because we've been a big net importer of timber and wood products. We've tended to be it's an easy market to access. And whenever there's a problem elsewhere in the world, generally the Scandinavian and European exporters, and in the past the Canadians, they'll dump it into the UK until a better market comes along. It would appear at the moment that there's a shortage of supply coming through from the forests, and in most markets timber prices are rising at the moment, but there's also a shortage of confidence in the end user market. So there's a very fine balance between available supply and demand, and a 5% increase in demand through government stimulus and change of policy would have quite a dramatic impact on the timber market, and we could see another run on prices like we've had in 2022 and 2019. Okay, next slide, please. To put all this into context, the UK produces quite a lot of timber. We think the UK production is around 15 million cubic meters. The bulk of that comes from Scotland and is coniferous. England still will produce 3.5 million cube a year of mainly softwood timber, but quite reasonable amounts of hardwood firewood, and a very, very small element of hardwood sword logs. And Wales, although it has highly productive ground and it's capable of growing good crops, its production is hovered around 1.5 to 1.7 million. But the volume that comes to market is greatly affected by the state of the market. So when prices go up, that encourages the private sector to bring timber to the market, and it makes it viable to harvest steeper ground, more difficult woodlands. And so you tend to get more wood coming to the market when the market's strong, and there's a natural contraction in supply when demand falls. At the same time, you've seen quite steady consolidation of the UK processing market and management sector. We've seen James Jones purchase Taylor Made, and BSW have taken over Myler and Scott Pallets. Gresham House have taken over FIM, and you've seen a number of other consolidations going on in the supply chain. It brings greater efficiency. It tends to drive professionalism. It does raise the question as to how competitive the market is when you've got less and less players in. Fortunately, at the moment, we're not in the situation the farmers are with the supermarkets, but we are noticing a consolidation of purchasers. The other one, that there is a bit of a disconnect in policy. There's quite a lot of drivers to encourage us to use more timber and wood products in construction to help decarbonise our building industry. We don't quite see that linkage coming through to woodland policy, and particularly woodland creation policy, in that most of the demand for timber in construction is for softwoods, and there is still a strong environmental element to the woodland creation policy, which is encouraging us to use native species and native provenances. Next slide, please. So if you look at what's actually being traded in the UK, the private sector in theory is the biggest seller by volume and value. And it's been very, very successful at expanding its market share as its forest resources come on. But we have to always be mindful that the Forestry Commission volume has underpinned the market, and for the processors it's been essential, because that's been the only bankable supply they've had, which they can then go to the funders, and when they invest in a new chipboard mill or a sawmill or any other production capacity, it's the Forestry Commission volume that allows them to have bankability, and that's encouraged the investment, which then the private sector is able to capitalise on. At the moment, today, spring 25, the energy wood market is very good. So firewood is strong, and north of England, Midlands, you're looking at 115 up to 140 pounds a tonne delivered. And those are very strong prices. They're the best I've seen. And latterly, chipwood, particularly going into the biomass industry, demand has been very strong. There's not a lot of stock anywhere at roadside, and the prices have crept up to 60, 70 pounds a tonne delivered. So the business of burning wood is very good. The threat to that is policy changes. Do we have changes in renewable heat incentive? Are there going to be further restrictions on domestic burning of firewood in terms of emissions from stoves and smoke-free zones? It would be a catastrophe for lowland forestry if anything happened to the firewood industry, because it's the main driver of that activity. But the big core of the market, the larger traded volumes, are softwood. These figures are really aimed at the smaller growers, tend to be non-certified mixed parcels of wood. So softwood logs, 75 to 85 pounds a tonne delivered currently. If you've got good spruce logs, they're FSC certified, easy access, yep, there's prices above that available, but you need to speak to your local buyers about that. And pallet wood, pallet demand is reasonable at the moment, but we're in a situation where the chipwood prices are nibbling away at the bottom of the pallet wood prices, which is putting that supply of that under quite serious constraints. And the other sector that's good at the moment is softwood fencing. Posts, stakes, rails, and jump rails. It's a pretty good business. There's good demand, and the prices are high, 85, 90, up to £100 a tonne delivered. Okay, next slide. So for you as the grower, how is the price you get for your timber determined? Well, the best model I've found of this is an American one, so excuse the terminology. But your buyer will walk through your woodland, he will do an assessment of the assortments in the crop, and he will then produce a product value. So he will know what percentage of chipwood, saw logs, pallet wood and firewood there is, and what that's worth to him delivered. He then will take off the costs that he has to incur to get that timber to the markets. So he's got the cost of logging, he's got the cost of haulage, any permits, any licenses, wildlife surveys and things. And then he's got to have a margin to cover his own costs. And we live in a commercial world. Hopefully he would like a profit margin, but also credit to cover the credit risk, because he's going to buy your trees, harvest them and sell them to other customers. So once you've got the product value and you've taken off the costs of winning that, you then have what's called the stumpage, and that is the price that the landowner gets for his trees. Now, as the market cycles fluctuate, when the market prices go up, it tends to be that filters straight down the value chain, and it's the stumpage that rockets up. Yes, there may be marginal increases in the harvesting and overhead costs, but it generally gets passed straight on to the buyer. But the counter to that is when demand falls and prices start to fall because there's an oversupply of windblown timber, or there's pound issues with currency forcing a lot of imported timber in, that also will filter back down, and it will go straight back down to the stump price. And that's why you see quite a lot of volatility in the price that comes through to the owner. In the UK, another influence is distance to market, because our haulage costs are quite high, and access to the site and availability of timber haulage can have quite a big impact on the price that the buyer is able to pay you for your timber. Generally, if it's a good quality crop and it's easy to get to, you will always get a good price. If it's a poor crop and it's difficult access, you sometimes may not get a price. Okay, next slide, please. Commonly, when I sit down and look back at timber sales that I've conducted on behalf of clients, or I've been involved with for clients, I see 5 key things that seem to influence how successful the timber sale is. You need to have adequate access. You can have the best crop in the world, but if you can't put it on a lorry and to haul it to the market, it's very, very difficult to get a price for it. Secondary, handling of timber, where it's got to be forward and round farm tracks and dropped in a farmyard, it's an expensive business, and it quite quickly eats into the margins. The second one is always sufficient volume. It costs as much to move a harvester and forwarder to harvest 200 tons as it does to 2,000. So there's quite noticeable economies of scale. So the big parcels always seem to get a higher price per ton than the small parcels when every other factor's the same. It's always good to have a species of tree that the market wants. In terms of softwood, the demand for spruce is consistent. That is always in demand. Some of the minor conifer species, it can be more difficult to place. And an interesting one is big Douglas fir. It is potentially worth very good money, but it's dependent on someone wanting it and prepared to pay good money at the time where you market it. And periodically the market is flooded. You have a nice parcel, but the prices don't reflect the quality because there's too much on the market. So with the softwoods, it tends to be spruce that's always in demand, Douglas fir and latterly larch. Some of the minor species like hemlock, not so, and grand fir, noble fir, not so interesting. Western red cedar, if it is potentially very valuable, but again, you've got to find someone who wants it when you sell it. You've then got to have a willing, reputable, and importantly, a credit-worthy buyer, so that you need to have someone who's going to buy your timber who you're going to get the money from. And I always stress that the highest price is not always the best price. The best price to you is the one that delivers your objectives and puts the money in your bank. And then almost without exception, timber sales that go well are the ones that are well managed. In England, we're seeing a re-emergence of the cutter merchants in the firewood and energy wood sectors. They do a valuable job. They are often very, very good operators. I increasingly see challenges with their business management. They're not as efficient with the way tickets. Their managing of their sites and compliance tends to be done by instinct rather than system. It is very, very important when you're selling to these guys that you have professional management on your side to protect you as the landowner. And when the market gets very frenzied, you get increased competition. That can also significantly increase risk. If people are competing hard to buying wood, they're over committing on price, then they overstretch themselves. That can be as big a risk as it is on a falling market when they're struggling to pay for the wood they've taken away. And again, that's where you need professional management. You need someone who knows what they're doing to look after you. Next slide, please. So it's a timber sale is not something that most landowners do every day. It tends to be something that we're sporadically involved with. Often you put a long, long time into growing your trees and a great deal of effort. You probably only harvest timber once or twice in your lifetime. It's quite evident that a well-presented and planned timber sale will get a better price, and it gives the buyer more confidence to pay for the wood, and it reduces the risk to both parties. So I've tried to outline the steps necessary to ensure that a woodland owner gets a fair price, he protects the asset that he's got, and that the work in the wood meets the objectives that he set for his woodland. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Because selling timber isn't something that you do every day and all the time, it's very important to sit down and understand what you want from the sale. What are you trying to do? Are you selling the timber because you've built up an investment pot and you want to cash it in? And how much do you know about the process of selling timber, and what's the state of the market? Are you selling at the bottom of the market, mid-cycle, or are you managing to hit the peak? It's also important to look at your timber sale in terms of your forest management objectives. If you've got a lot of thinning work and you've only got one prime clearfell parcel, and you want to do some work, it's maybe in the downward cycle, sell the thinning parcels. They often sell well in a downward cycle, and keep your clearfell parcel for when the market's rising and the strong demand. I frequently come across situations where the owners want to fell the timber, but because they haven't done much work in the wood in 10 or 15 years, there are other considerations. They need to consult with neighbours. There might be tenants' land to cross. There might be other family members that have an interest in it. So make sure you consult with the other parties involved with it. Possibly look out to any of the purchase of the woodland. Check there's no restrictive covenants. There's legal complications over access. And increasingly, there are environmental considerations. So are there bats present in the woodland? Are there badgers, birds of prey? And ensure that you've got all the necessary permits in place to carry out the work before you start. And is the access still adequate for the operations you plan? Because a lot of woodlands, when they were planted in the 50s and 60s, The access was put in for an 8-wheeler lorry carrying 15, 16 tons of timber with an overall weight of 25. We are now going to put articulated lorries in, 44-ton gross vehicle weight, and we might be wanting to move 6, 8, 10 loads a day. That's a substantial upgrade on the access requirement to what was originally put in. And as a landowner, how are you insured? And have you got the correct insurance cover for the operations that are planned? And it's just a quick phone call to your insurer and check that's there. And sometimes it's easier to actually set down and think, well, where do I want to end? What is the journey I'm undertaking? Where am I going on holiday? Which city am I going to? Well, apply this to your woodland. What do I want to achieve at the end of the operations? What is it going to look like? Okay, next step. It's a professional woodland manager. He will do this operation, and this is what his role is. So get some help from a forestry manager. If you are deciding which forestry manager you want to work with, it's always a good idea to get 2 or 3, 4 in, have a talk to them. They all have different skill sets, the different personalities. It's understanding which one you are able to work with and you can relate with, and then get him to draw up, help you with your timber sales. So prepare a simple management plan of what the operations are designed to deliver. So identify what crop you've got, any boundaries, hazards, the access routes and key features. Also the management goals. I like to have a little silvicultural prescription as to what I'm wanting the harvesting operation to achieve in the woodland and the steps within this that has to be done. So put in road, put in new gate, build ramps, put stacking area in. I want you to thin this compartment first before you do the clear fell. And then look at timings of the operations. Is it going to be done outside of the shooting season? Is it an area of ancient woodland with particular fauna or flora constraints, which means you might have to work later on in the year? So sit down, consider all of that, understand where you want to end at the end of it, and produce a simple budget and cash flow. It isn't hard and fast, the budget and cash flow, but it helps you plan and understand if there is money to be spent up front to put infrastructure in. Do you do that, or do you select a buyer and ask them to do it as part of the contract? Okay, next slide. Once you've decided on what's in your woodland and that you're going to have a timber sale, then you need to decide what you are going to sell. So you've decided which compartments you're going to fell. You need to mark the boundaries of these so it's clear to buyer that's what they're looking at. A simple job to understand what the crop is. You can do sample plots, or you can pay a manager to come in and measure it, but quantify what's there. So at the very least, they know the area, the mix of species, the approximate number of trees, and the average tree size, diameter at breast height, and average size of each tree. Importantly, any known hazards and constraints. So are the private water supplies, streams, areas of steep ground, wet ground, badger sets, birds' nests, things like that. If you have any areas of long-term retention or if there's, environmental features, please make sure those are marked on the map. The more information you can give the buyer, the better it is for his decision making. And then identify the areas where you're going to have your loading bays, machine storage, fuel and oil storage areas, vehicle parking. A few photos of the crop helps. Silvicultural prescriptions. Are you wanting a line thinning? What are they to do? Are they taking every 5th row, every 8th row, and what are they doing with the side thinnings, or is it a purely silvicultural thin? So you help the buyer understand what you're wanting to achieve, and then get your permissions. Don't sell it till you've got a felling license, your SSI consent, and any other environmental consents, and the agreement of any landowners across whom your access runs, because this is all de-risking the sale. Once all that's in place, the buyer knows that when he's pressed the hammer, he's hit the bid on and you've accepted it, he's ready to go. He can put the harvester and the machine operators in at a time to suit him. Okay, next step. When you're gathering the information on what the crop you're going to sell, it's pretty good. This is a list that I generally like to see. So a sale description, which would include crop information, and then we want a location map. Where in the country is it? Access map. How do you get to the site? So where's the lorry route? Is there a separate route for the contractors to go in day to day? Where can they move? Where does the harvester get to? If they are several different compartments around a farm or estate, how do they get from A to B to C? Do a simple hazard and constraint assessment. Are there any bridges with weight restrictions, power lines, water courses, underground services, schools on the access route, anything that should be considered in the decision making in the purchase? Put the copy of the felling license with the sale instructions and give us time scale of when you want the work done, and then have viewing arrangements. If they want to go and see the parcel, who do they ring to get the information from? How do they get the combination for the gate? What time can they go and see it? And before you start the sale, it's always a good idea to take a photo of the state of the roads going into the site, the forest sites and the loading bays, so that both parties know what the condition was before work is there. As well, consider how you want to sell it. Are you going to sell it as a lump sum, a weighted average price, or a price per product? And this is a conversation to have with your Woodland manager. And then how do you want to sell it? Do you want to go to an open market auction, a tender, or would you like to negotiate with a chosen buyer, privately? And what are the payment terms? Are they 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Are they going to pay some up front and then the balance on completion? And do you require a performance bond? It's quite common in the construction industry where a performance bond is used to bind the buyers to the contract. When they've successfully completed the contract, it's returned. It is sometimes used in forestry sales. In my time, I've only ever had to use it twice, but we do frequently take one. And then together with your manager, set a reserve price. So have a realistic expectation of what price you want to achieve and a point below which you're not prepared to go. Next step, please. Okay. In timber auctions, we primarily sell by tender and auction, and the tenders tend to be restricted. The buyer says that he wants a certain caliber of buyer. Sorry, the seller says he wants a certain caliber of operator. We will then produce him a list, send the details to them, and we will run a tender where they all put a sealed bid in by a certain time. The highest price we would then go to the owner with. We try and agree in a sale. If not, we go to the underbidder. We frequently run auctions. Online auctions are very, very good, particularly for clear fell parcels, where there's quite distinct boundaries and an agreed standard of work. And in some cases, we will also negotiate because certain sellers have a long-standing relationship with a buyer and they just want to go back to him. They're happy with the quality of work and terms. It's just a benchmarking exercise to see the prices are fair. Next slide. Once you've selected a buyer, get a contract in place. All forest managers will have a standard contract, but that protects both you and the buyer and seller, and it's a key document. If ever anything goes wrong, you refer to the contract. The details of what you should have in that will be available on the slides afterwards. Next slide, please. One of the important things is supervising the sale, and there's a number of things to consider here. You should always have a defined roles and responsibilities, but someone has to manage the site on behalf of the landowner, and they should hold a pre-commencement meeting with the purchaser, and at that point they agree all the key elements of the operations and sign and map. It goes on the map and it's signed and dated. You should then visit the site regularly to check that work is going on according to what you've in your prescriptions, and that the timber receipts are being administered, so the weigh tickets are being returned promptly, timber is being uplifted, and the invoices are being issued for the timber that's dispatched. And the forest manager will report regularly to the owner on the progress of the sale. It's important that whoever's supervising liaises directly with the forest works manager, who's the buyer's appointed representative. You should have a clear chain of command so you know who's speaking to who. And the contract and the supervision is vital to protect the owner's interests, to make sure that someone is looking after his asset and how his interests in his woodland. Final slide, please. The bit that seems to get forgotten is closing off the sale. And if you sit down and look at contract law, you'll realise that it's all very well to issue a contract. You can work to the contract, but when both parties are happy that the contract is completed, you should close the contract off. And the steps to that is normally once the buyer notifies you that he's getting near to completing operations on site, your representative will meet him on site and they'll hold a completion meeting. At that point, they check that the detail of the contract was being complied with, particularly are all the water courses unblocked, is protected areas being kept tidy, rides are open, how are the brushes being treated, do any repairs need to be done to the roads, have any gates or anything being damaged, and has all the timber been uplifted and paid for. And once it's all been completed, you then should issue a letter releasing a completion letter that says to the buyer the contract has now been completed and is finished. And then at that point, you return the performance bond, which in most instances is never needed, and it's just there to hold as security. Okay, last slide. For the owner that's not a frequent seller, there's a few things to consider that have come to light since I originally wrote that presentation. There's been much more focus on roles and responsibilities in terms of health and safety. It's worth going on the FISA website and downloading the guidance, because it gives notes on what the landowner's responsibility is and what their agent should be doing. And then the buyer appoints a forest works manager. He has a contractor that runs the site, and then his people on site are defined as subcontractor and worker and site safety representative. There was some discussion when we were writing this about selecting contractors. My view is that is the job of the forest works manager. As you, as the landowner and the grower, the agent, you should be offering your parcel to the market. You're engaging a professional buyer to buy the timber and work it. It's his job and his knowledge and expertise to get competent contractors and to work within the timescales that are there. If you have issues with how the work's done, you should address that directly to the forest works manager. And there is quite clearly defined reporting procedures that should be in place. Okay, any questions?
Right, Ron.
Thank you, Ollie and Annie. And apologies for everyone that we've run over ever so slightly. Annie, I think, has answered most of the questions in the chat, but there were a couple left over, which I will just run by you now, Annie, if you're still there. One of them is, yes. Can different landowners group their projects together?
Yes, that's right. So group projects can be, there's no geographical limitation. They can be completely different landowners, completely different locations. It's just about bringing them together so that the validator does them as one. And you can work with a project developer. A list of them can be found on the Woodland Carbon Code website who can support you to find other landowners.
Great, thank you. And then one more for you, Annie. How many cycles of verification are needed over the 100 years?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I missed that one. So the first verification has to be year 5. And then beyond that, they have to be at least every 10 years. But you can do them more frequently if you wanted to, but that would be just more expensive. But yeah, it has to be year 5 and then every 10 years from then on. You can self-verify, so you don't have to bring in a third-party accreditor every time. And self-verifying is much cheaper because you don't bring Soil Association onto the site, but you can't convert units and sell them at that point. But if you want to wait 30 years before you convert them, that is an option.
Right, thank you. So I think that was all the questions on the Woodland Carbon Code. And then Ollie, there were a couple for you. What are the best commercial hardwoods to plant? You need to unmute, Ollie, sorry.
I'd always say the first starting point is to run an ESC report on your woodland area. I think the key traits to look for when you're choosing your species, and this applies whether it's hardwood or softwood, is quality of the timber. So does it give you the option to grow saw logs, pallet wood, fencing, energy wood and firewood? Natural durability, I think, is going to become an increasingly important trait. So that means species like oak, western red cedar will probably attract a premium in the future because of their natural durability. Ability to produce with good management, high quality timbers. So can it produce veneers, then sawn, good grade sawn timber. So oak is a good one. Yield is also an important factor. What's its ability to grow? So where I am in Yorkshire, we find sycamore's a good one. Although in the past we had good markets for sycamore logs, those have gone, but it's very good for firewood. It grows quickly and it regenerates prolifically. So yeah, stem straightness, yield, durability and suitability to the site.
Right, thanks, Ollie. And then one final question for you was, you mentioned softwood fencing. Is there a market for UK Robinia?
I've just spotted that one. It's a good question. I have seen Robinia being used for deer fencing. It's driven by the desire for durability. And my instinct is that durable products will become more in demand. I don't know enough about Robinia to know about its growing, but from what I can see, there is a demand for the product. I've seen people using sweet chestnut as round fencing for deer fencing, which we've never seen before. I've seen Robinia used in Denmark quite extensively for deer fencing. So there's no reason. I think the demand will come in the UK.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, I'll just pass back to Nigel just to wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
Well, I'd like to thank the speakers. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody that's joined in with the webinar today. I hope you've benefited from the things we've had to say, both existing owners of woodland and people who are interested in planting new woodland. If there's anyone out there that's interested in planting new woodland, can I suggest that you get in touch with your local area land use advisor, and you can find contact details on the gov.uk website. So thank you very much.